Hello and welcome to the garden. Well, on a previous video I had a comment asking how the second cropping potatoes were doing, and I thought I'd just do a quick update on those. So I think back in sort of latter half of July I planted our second cropping potatoes, and I had those outdoors for some weeks. Now I had two varieties, Nicola and Charlotte, and a whole range of different pot sizes, and then the blight came. So I had some outdoor tomatoes. They were just some spares that I chucked in the actually in our fruit cage, because there was a little bit of space there, and I just put some spare plants in there. They got wiped out before I could get a harvest from them. The potatoes at that point looked as though they might have escaped. I moved them under cover, and I've got in the polytunnel here, I've got the three big pots. They've got Charlottes in, and the smaller pots went into the greenhouse, and they got completely trashed by the blight. Now in the polytunnel here they did a lot better. I think in these big pots they were a little slower getting to the top, so I think possibly they missed that first attack of blight entirely, and for some time I thought these were going to be perfect. Now back in September when I did the garden tour, during that tour video I spotted some blight in here, and I tried to keep them going for as long as possible. They did have flowers on at that time, and that's usually a good indicator that tubers are starting to form, and I thought if I could keep them going for another couple of weeks I could at least get something from these pots. I did manage to keep it going for another couple of weeks, but of course eventually, you know, just picking off the blighted leaves and the stems, it works for a little while if the infection's not too bad, but of course it's a losing battle, and eventually they succumb to the blight, and I cut the haulms down. That was some weeks ago, so these tubs have just sat here now. It's always a good idea once you cut the blighted foliage to leave the potatoes alone for a few weeks. Blight requires living tissue to survive, so you cut them down, remove the blighted foliage. It's perfectly fine to put it on your compost. It doesn't hang around in a pile of dead material. It does need that living tissue to survive. So we cut those down, threw them away, and we've just left these. Now if the blight hasn't affected the tubers, these now will be fine. So I'm a little bit unsure as to what we've got here. I do know that we've got at least a few tubers because I've seen them when I was mucking about here, but I don't expect a great crop. The reason being, these should still be growing now, and it's been some weeks since I cut them down, so they ought to be growing until, well, I'd hope to get them going into November. So if they were cut short at the end of October, that would have been fine, but ideally it would have been great if they went a couple of weeks into November, but they haven't really been growing long enough to give me a full crop. So what I'm expecting to find is a collection of fairly small tubers and not too many of them. But actually the question that was asked in the comments on the previous video wasn't about how the potatoes were doing exactly, but about the compost, because when I planted these up I'd run out of a decent compost mixture. So I was making up my own blend with horse compost and some good quality compost, and I ran out of that, and I was left with piles of this modern fluffy stuff which I'm not that keen on. And I know from some of the comments on previous videos there lots of gardeners are not entirely happy with this sort of compost. And what I did was plant in the good stuff, but then top these big pots up with the fluffy stuff. And so the comment was, how did they do topped up with that fluffy stuff? I don't like that fluffy stuff. I don't think stuff likes to germinate in it, and there are some issues. So it does tend to form sort of a crusty cap on the top, and it can be quite dry on the top while still being rather wet underneath. So before watering, you've got to have a bit of a rummage there to make sure it actually needs watering, because it looks like it's desperately parched, but actually deeper into the mixture it's really still quite damp. So there is the possibility of accidentally overwatering. I also had to break up that surface to sort of free some of the shoots. They were getting all caught up with this clumps of fluffy compost. I didn't like that at all, but actually I think for potatoes it doesn't really matter too much what you top them off with. The plants really are getting their nutrition from that good layer of compost. I could probably have put grass clippings or straw on the top. It's more than anything else, it's to exclude the light. So I don't think it will have done too bad a job for these potatoes, but let's have a little look and see whether I've got anything worth eating in here. So I'm not expecting great things here, but let's have a little look. And yeah, I mean, this stuff is really sort of claggy on the top. I don't like that at all. If I just start chucking some of this away, well, that's not a bad tuber, considering that these haven't really grown long enough. And well, there are quite a few here. As expected, they are rather small, but it's certainly better than nothing. You can see this stuff sort of clumps together, and it's not nice. I think next year when I reuse this compost, this stuff will end up mixed up with other compost material, and it will be fine to reuse. It's not great on its own, but I think in a mixture it's going to be a lot better. I thought I was being a bit optimistic bringing a bucket to put the crop in, but surprisingly there are quite a few tubers here, and they're obviously pretty small. Charlottes will get far bigger than this, but these weren't growing for very long at all. I'm trying to think how long it would have been. I mean, it might have been something like 9 weeks at the most, 9 weeks, I think. And that's not normally long enough for these. I mean, this is a second early. It needs longer than that. But of course, we're used to starting potatoes in the spring when it's much cooler and growth is slower, and starting them in late summer, conditions are much better and they grow away much more quickly. So I think if you stop a potato at that point in the spring, it's not going to have done much. But these were growing really great before the blight took them out, so I think that is the reason that I've got some sort of crop in here. And there's no sign of any problem with these tubers. They are perfectly sound. They're very clean. I mean, that's one of the nice things about growing in pots. The tubers do tend to come out a lot cleaner than if they were in the ground. You can see just how lumpy this compost remains even now. And nothing really wants to grow through these lumps. There are no roots penetrating these solid clumps of stuff. It's not good. So that's the harvest. It is rather disappointing from a tub of this size. But actually, I'm pretty pleased because I didn't expect to get anything from my second cropping potatoes this year. Now, if they'd had that extra 2 or 3 weeks, these would have been a decent size. I've got lots of small ones, but I've also got plenty that are a useful size. So it's not a great harvest, but I'm relieved to get something for my effort. So anyway, it doesn't look as though they really cared about this compost too much. I don't want to use this stuff anymore for this. I certainly don't want to use it as it is, maybe blended with some other materials to change that texture. The way this clumps together, it's really quite horrid. So we'll see. I mean, this stuff will be recycled for next season, and I think it will be perfectly fine used in that way, but no, it's not great. So it's always disappointing when blight strikes, but if you have a similar situation where it's not too bad, it is worth trying to keep the plants going for that extra couple of weeks. Had I not done that, I think I would have pretty much nothing worth picking here at all. So overall, it's not too bad. Anyway, that is all for this video. Thanks very much for watching, and bye for now.